It all began with the forging of the great rings. 3 were given to the elves, immortal, wisest, and fairest of all beings. 7 to the dwarf lords, great miners and craftsmen of the mountain halls. And 9 rings were gifted to the race of men who above all else desire power. For within these rings was bound the strength and will to govern over each race. But they were all of them deceived, for another ring was made. The Lord of the Rings.
You're listening to Writing Roots, brought to you by Aspen House Publishing.
Welcome to Writing Roots. I'm Lee Hull.
And I'm Lee Esses.
We are on a new month, so we are on a new topic. Throughout November, we will be looking into numbers and tropes surrounding numbers, how numbers can be used effectively in storytelling. We are going to count down each episode starting with 7 next episode. Today's the introduction.
We don't want to neglect some of our favorite numbers that are higher than 7, so just a quick overview, different types of things to start your research dive. One of the things that we can't ignore is the number 13. This is often seen as something evil or ominous. You see this a lot in horror movies, these kinds of things. Even Trelawney had the, I can't sit down or else there will be 13 here. 13 can be seen as an ominous number if you want to just throw things off. It can be a little witchy in the Dresden Files, but it feels uncomfortable because it's a prime number and it's fairly large.
2 other numbers that are higher than 7 that are associated with particular things include 69, nice, and 420. And if you don't know what those are, ask your parents, I guess.
That's not something we're going to discuss in today's episode, but if you know, you know, these numbers carry a weight and meaning behind them. One of the other things that you will see is the number 1000 associated with years. For whatever reason, whenever I read fantasy books, I will always divide it by 10. 1,000 years ago, these things happened. Mentally, it's more like 100 years ago as far as how much the world has changed from 100 years ago. But 1,000 years tends to be the approximate duration of a dynasty back in ye olden days. So that's why that number feels very weighty and heavy and epic.
There's also, when you include these really big numbers for dates, it becomes something incomprehensible. So, Lord of the Rings, for 3,500 years, the ring passed out of all knowledge. 3,500 years is a long, long time ago. That's like 1500 BC for us between then and now. And look how much the world has changed.
Yeah, the alphabet was invented by the Phoenicians around 1500 BC. So that's why I kind of do the divide by 10.
I guess in Lord of the Rings, you have to give them a little bit of a pass because there are elves that lived thousands of years. So, you know, world scale, depending on world building.
Yeah. But that is kind of the point, is these really large numbers are just incomprehensibly long when you're talking about time.
And speaking of world building, numbers are a very important aspect of that can often be overlooked. If you're just throwing out random dates, random time periods, whatever, it feels random. But if you really take the time to use numbers intentionally, whether that's time, whether that's amount, whatever it is, it can really help enrich your story and your world.
One of the things that you will see a number applied to quite frequently in your world building are your facets of your magic system. So something like in the 5th element, that's in the title. There are 5 different elements in this magic/sci-fi system that they have.
In Brandon Sanderson's Cosmere, you have in the Scadrial worlds your 16 metals, your allomantic metals that all have very specific purposes. That's very intricately connected with the 16 shards that broke off of Adonalcium. all of these little pieces that are interconnected, and 16 is a very important number throughout the Cosmere.
In something like the world building of the video game Guild Wars, you have the 6 gods, and each of them covers a facet of magic. And not necessarily if you are this type of caster, you must follow this type of person, because the same god who is in charge of warriors who wield swords and axes, that god is also in charge of the fire elementalists. So these kinds of things where even if your one character isn't automatically one-to-one aligned, you can still understand the characters of the gods because you've got a number wrapped around it, and you can remember to list them all that way.
Outside of magic systems, but still within world building, you can look at societal structures. You can look at political structures such as oligarchies, where they have a council, and usually that council is made up of 3 or 5 or 7 or 9 or however many is needed to run the country. And it's usually an odd number so that there is always a tiebreaker available.
And they're often called the Council of 7. Their number is wrapped into the power that they hold.
But within societal structures as well, you can have 3 different castes or things split into different numbers that you can then take and apply it to the rest of your book.
Another way to use numbers is to mark progress for your main character, especially if you're doing a hero's journey type story. Having something like, these are the number of mini bosses, the number of bad guys you're going up against. The ring wraiths, for example, we know there are 9 of them. We don't have to see all 9 of them all the time. We can see 5 of them after Frodo and wonder where the other 4 are. But we can do that math very quickly because we have a number associated with them.
You can have something like in The Mummy 2, where there's a treasure map that they need to follow, whether it's step after step, but it's very laid out and precise in what they need to do along the way.
Now, one of the ways that you can use numbers in your stories is simply to make it feel epic. Like in our opener quote, we had those numbers gradually get larger and larger, 3, then 7, then 9, then 1. That 1 feels larger than 9 because of the scaling that we had, and therefore it's much heavier.
Also including the number of continents in a world or countries or cultures can really make the world feel big and spacious, even though it's occurring in a very small area. Look at the Stormlight Archives with Brandon Sanderson, how many different cultural places he name drops throughout the story without going into detail that makes the world feel very expansive.
And then, of course, you can always build up to this number, and the more time you build adding weight to this number, the heavier it will feel, and the more impressive it will feel. An example of this is 42 from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, where we don't know what the 42 represents, but it represents life, the universe, and everything.
Now, there are times where numbers are not going to be important. Like really big numbers, you don't need to say that there's 1 kajillion spaceships. Nobody's going to believe you. So unless your intention is that exaggeration that nobody's going to believe, you can just say there was a ton.
Speaking of a ton, you don't want to use numbers for measurements. So there were exactly 6 people over there. If that number is not relevant, there were a bunch. There were a handful, a half a dozen, maybe. Or the table is exactly 34.5 inches long. Yes, that's a detail. That's not a detail we care about in the least.
Yeah, that's only something you include if it's relevant. And the same thing goes for, I would say, prices on things, especially if you're writing contemporary fiction, where somebody's idea of a really expensive dress is going to be different from person to person. So you just allude to the fact that it was very expensive and people can input their own belief of expensive into that.
This is where the joke about Americans using anything except the metric system to measure, where that comes from. And I would say definitely lean into it. The hole in the ground was about the size of a washing machine. Lets us know exactly how big that was without needing measurements. The dagger was as long as his forearm. Okay, we have an idea of how long the weapon is, regardless of if their forearm is a foot long or 16 inches if they're really big. Using numbers there doesn't help us imagine it. Use a metaphor or simile, and we'll be able to much better imagine the story.
You also don't want to use numbers very often for really anything that the reader is expected to remember unless you plan to repeat it. If that number is important for the story, for the plot, then you include it more than once. But if you're just listing a number one time, maybe just generalize it. Use a metaphor, say a bunch or a handful or whatever, instead of listing a specific number.
All of this information is to help you tell the best story possible. Numbers are a way that we communicate. They are a way that we are able to tell specific things and add weight to specific moments in the story. So we definitely don't suggest that you completely neglect them. Rather, find the right way to use them, and you can lean into the audience's expectations with particular numbers in order to enrich your world. So when you're considering putting numbers on the page, understand how you as an audience member read those numbers, and decide if this is the best way to communicate the thing in your head, and if it is,
Write selfishly.
If you have a question or comment for our hosts or a topic you'd like us to cover, send us an email at writingroots@aspenhousepublishing.com or find us on Facebook by searching for Aspen House Publishing.